Chapter 21 brings us into the late 18th and 19th centuries. During this time period, we have the movement known as Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. And so this takes place during the Industrial Revolution, the American and French Revolutions. And this is basically a shift in a more rational and scientific approach to religious, political, and social values. And so this is one of the most significant shifts in the way people live. This is the most significant shift since people became Neolithic hunters and gatherers to agricultural communities. And so that was around 10,000 years before this movement. And so we see this renewed interest in democracy, liberty, and self-determination. Traditional values that have been placed upon the culture are starting to be challenged. This does lead to an uncertainty about the place of art and the artist in society. We see this break in this traditional art patronage we've seen up until this point. So on one hand, while that could be seen as a negative because art is not being supported monetarily, on the other hand, this does lead to the development of a variety of different artistic styles, because there's a lot more interaction between peoples and cultures during this time period. And artists, if you're not working for someone, you're free to think on your own and come up with your own ideas and be creative. So we're going to look at quite a few different movements during this chapter. We're going to look at Neoclassicism, Romanticism, and then Realism and Impressionism. And then we're going to look at a few post-impressionistic pieces that kind of develop Impressionism a little bit further. So first, we're going to look at Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is basically a rejection of Rococo style. We'll see, you notice this a lot throughout history, where we see one movement and then something is a counter to that movement and something is a counter to that movement. It's the exact same in art. This painting here, The Happy Accident on the Swing, is one of the last images we saw in the last chapter we read. And it's the Rococo style, which is very decorative. It pretty much just depicts this life of ease. There's this very dramatic, for example, this painting where the woman's just swinging and her shoe falls off and there happens to be a man there to catch it in his lap. And so Neoclassicism is a rejection of this. It happens during the French Revolution. And these artists believe that art should serve some kind of beneficial social purpose, such as governmental reform. And so this piece here by David is a story about virtue and liberty. These are three brothers taking up their father's sword to go defend Rome. Take courage, your cause is a noble one, is the kind of essence of this painting. It's painted in the style of classical relief sculpture. It has strong side light, which could be a Baroque influence, which emphasizes the figures in the foreground. We see this arcade, these Roman arches in the background. And the columns actually separate the three major parts of the painting. We have the sons on the left, the father handing over the swords in the center, and then we have the women on the right. It almost resembles a stage. And so what's interesting too about this painting are the women on the right. They are sitting in the corner, overcome with emotion. It was believed during this time period that women were unable to participate in serious decision making because of their emotions, and so they were excluded a lot from public life. And so this is a great depiction of that. We also have the development of Romanticism, and it starts around 1820, and it's pretty much the opposite of the Enlightenment. It's more based on emotional expression. They believed that your imagination and your emotions are much more important than being rational or being able to reason. And so a lot of times they would want to convey, with an N, the feeling of the event. And so instead of depicting actually what happened, they would want to depict what feeling they were left with after an event. Here we see the painting by Francisco Goya, the 3rd of May. And during this time, we have French armies invading Spain. And Goya first welcomed the French and Napoleon, but then he realized that he wasn't really doing exactly what he was saying, and he was actually destroying these democratic values that Goya thought Napoleon was kind of defending. And so he starts to defend the ideals of the revolution and starts to side with the Spaniards. And so on the 2nd of May, the French troops occupied the city of Madrid, and a riot against the French broke out on the square. The French cavalry was basically ordered to cut down the crowds. And so during the night, firing squads were set up and shot everyone suspected of causing any type of disturbance. And so that's what this painting is depicting, the 3rd of May. And so we see this pattern of light and dark. We see a lot of emphasis and subordination with this. We see the light figure of the Spaniard is very lit up, and so we know he's very important. His clothes are very ragged, and so we can kind of get this feeling of the way he's being treated. And as you look to the right, you see all of the guns of the soldiers, and they're lit up. These very thin lines of light kind of guide your eye to the Spaniard, who's kind of in this gesture of kind of giving up, this kind of helpless gesture, but he's still being shot at. And then we see the soldiers that are a little darker in their nice crisp uniforms. And so we get the idea of this feeling of kind of helplessness of what's happening to his people on the 3rd of May. And so this painting pretty much becomes kind of a universal protest against the brutality of tyrannical governments. And so you may have seen this painting before. It becomes very popular after this. So artists, you know, are starting to get their foothold a little bit and getting out from under these patrons that are supporting them and being able to think for themselves. And they kind of, I don't know, kind of turn a corner that may be a little unexpected. Neoclassicism and Romanticism turns into what we know as academic art. And basically they turned these ideas of Neoclassicism and Romanticism into this formula for creating art and this formula for beauty. And so these formulas were taught by this Academy of Fine Arts, and that's how you were taught to create art. You were not an artist unless you went to the academy and learned this academic art and created it the exact same way that they said to. And so this is a little different than how we would think, you know, artists are creative and, you know, want to think for themselves and make things the way they want to. And so as soon as they get out from underneath these patrons, they kind of shoot themselves in the foot and create academic art. This academy was also in charge of the Salon, and that was the only known art exhibit of this time. And all artists that went through the academy would have their work shown in the Salon. So there were these huge shows with artwork hung on the wall from floor to ceiling, but those were the artists, and that was the only way you could be an artist. And so basically the rest of the 19th century is this act of rebellion against academic art. And so we're going to look at a few of these movements. The first movement to rebel against academic art is realism, and it started around 1850. And it basically depicts the ordinary existence of everyday things without idealism or exaggeration. And so they believe that art should deal with the human experience and be based on observation. And so we've seen this come up quite a few times throughout history, but now it's called realism. And so Courbet actually revived realism. Remember, we saw it in Roman sculpture, and we saw it in the paintings of the Renaissance, such as Bruegel's paintings. And so he really just wants to bring back the dignity into these ordinary things. So here in the Stone Breakers, we see men are breaking stones. This is a very ordinary job of the road workers. It's almost life-size, and so the people are basically realistic. It's not idealized or dramatized at all. It's just very straightforward documentation of these workers. And so critics at this time, the people of the Academy, believed that this was the artistic and moral decline of art. that to paint such unpleasant and trivial subjects on such a grand scale was the enemy of art. And so this was very scandalized and looked down upon during this time. Courbet was an anarchist, and so he was against the government. He believed that it was very oppressive and served the wealthy, and so it would make sense that he would also be against academic art. He was in many associations to kind of, bring forth art and the government. And so in 1855, he actually started practicing what he was preaching. And so he started to set up his own art exhibits outside of the salon. And so he was one of the first people to do this, and he would just go show his artwork and set up an exhibit, much like you would see today, how you see artists show their work in coffee houses and, not as formal as a gallery. And so that goes all the way back to Courbet and his influence. Edouard Monet painted during this time period too. He was actually a predecessor of the Impressionistic movement and actually led to being a founder of Impressionism. And he is probably the most controversial artist in Paris during the 1860s. He actually studied to become an academic master, and so he learned all the rules and knew how to paint perfectly as academic standards go. And then he broke away from the tradition. So he learned all the rules basically so he could break them. And that's what you see a lot of times in art school. You learn the rules, and so you know what rules you're breaking and why you're breaking them. And you still have your own creative side. And so the way this was painted, it was very scandalous for this time period. We have this female figure with very little shading. It almost looks like she's glowing and kind of hovering there in space. We have these flat patches of color throughout that aren't even blended. There's bare spots of the canvas that are showing through in the light areas where there's no paint on the canvas. We have light shapes against dark shapes, cool colors against warm colors. There is a lot of concern with the visual issues over the content of this painting. And so he's really studying how paint goes on your canvas. What happens if you don't blend it and you just have this flat area of green? Or what happens if the canvas shows through and the paint is very thin? And so he's really dealing with these visual issues. And then also, the subject matter is a little different than what we've seen so far. We have this female nude with dressed males. And even though there's probably a lot of scandalous stories we can transfer onto this painting, but actually he wasn't even concerned with that. He believed that this painting had no allegory, no history, and no myth. He was completely just working with the composition and something that he thought was interesting. And so he is very scandalous and very controversial, and he later becomes the leader of a group known as the Impressionists. And so Impressionism is also a rejection of these academic ideals of art. And basically they would paint impressions of what the eye actually sees rather than what the mind knows. And so this is how we tend to generalize things instead of actually seeing them. For example, water is not just blue. If you look at water, there's reflections of greens and pinks and yellows all throughout that water. And so they would want to depict exactly what they saw. And they would do a lot of landscapes and outdoor scenes. Light was very important, how they could capture light. They were labeled Impressionists by an artist critic because they believed that their work was very sketchy. It's almost like how you would draw a quick sketch in your sketchbook. These artists would do that with paint and a paintbrush. But the painters of this movement really liked that and were like, yeah, that is what we're trying to do. And so they took that on as their name, and that's where Impressionism came from. And so at the top we see one piece by Monet at a railroad station, and he would actually come set his easel up there and paint what he saw. And so it's not about this human drama, as you can see. It's more about the light and this kind of sketchy quality of this kind of moment in time that he was trying to capture. And we see this painting on the bottom right by Monet, who painted this outside. It's just this lake water with this boat on it. And so as you can see very easily in this, that they would use these small dabs of color, these separate brush strokes. And so they wouldn't blend. They'd be doing it so quickly they wouldn't blend the paints like on a something to create the perfect color before applying it to the canvas. They would actually blend it directly on the canvas, doing it very quickly and sketchy-like. And so from a distance, everything blends together and it creates the colors that your eyes should see, but really up close it has this very messy, loose quality. So Renoir was also an impressionist, and unlike Monet, he wanted to concentrate a little bit more on humans as a subject matter. And so one of his popular themes was this contemporary middle class of people that we now have because of the Industrial Revolution. So we have people who are no longer farmers that work, you know, from sun up to sundown, and that's their whole life. We now have factory jobs where we work our shifts and then we come home. And so we have these leisure activities that we can do in our free time. And so he really wanted to capture the mood of these people, and so he was sitting in this area and had his canvas set up and painted these people that he saw. And so remember, light is very important with Impressionists. And so you can see all these splotches of yellow all throughout this painting, and he's actually depicting exactly what the light looked like. There was a tree branch hanging over him and over these people, and so the light was very spotty coming through the leaves and the branches of this tree, and so you see that reflecting on the bodies and the clothing in this crowd of people. Degas was another Impressionist painter. What he was kind of known for in his painting was changing the idea of the composition. One of the things he is most known for is kind of cutting off these figures and subjects, as we see on the right hand side of this painting right here, where these figures are being cut off, and so we have this idea of, you know, something's going on outside and beyond the walls of this composition. And so we still see this brush-like quality that's very loose and expressive, and we can see the sense of light that's hitting the ballet dancers on the right-hand side of this painting. And so this painting is very different from anything we've seen so far since midterm. If you notice, this is actually a woman painter, Mary Cassatt, and we have not seen any woman artists since before midterm. So all throughout our history, we have not seen any. And so Mary Cassatt was born pretty high in society. She had a lot of money. She studied in Paris, but was not really allowed in the academy. They would do things such as, in a figure drawing class, a lot of times you would draw from a nude model, and to, you know, learn anatomy and to learn how to depict exactly what you were seeing. But since she was a woman, they wouldn't let her stay in the room when the model was there. And so it kind of defeated the purpose of being in the class. And so eventually she befriended Degas and Monet, and so she became an Impressionist painter. And so in this painting we start to see this very subtle feminist content in her work, because she really didn't agree with how she was being treated. And so based on the clothing styles, we can see that the man was hired to take her out on a boat ride. Her clothes are a lot nicer than his clothes, and so it's obvious they're not a couple, but that he was hired. And so she is very assertive in this painting and going out alone with a hired man on a boat ride with her small child. And you can kind of see this kind of glance of tension between them. And so she's kind of giving a little insight of the world of women and their concerns during this time period. So the next few paintings we're going to look at are basically post-impressionist paintings. And during this period, artists did not share any single style, but they're being influenced by Impressionism in one way or another. And we'll look at a few different ways that they're being influenced by Impressionism, but kind of taking it on as their own style. First we have Seurat, a Sunday on Le Grand Jatte, and this is, he wants to develop more the formal structure of painting. And so the Impressionists had that very sketchy, loose quality about their composition, but he wanted to change that. And so he used the kind of subject matter, light, and color qualities of Impressionism, but he wanted to move away from this kind of fleeting moment, more to these carefully constructed compositions like we see here. And so what he is known for is actually taking these loose dabs of color that the Impressionists started using it, and he shrunk them down to these small dots. And it's known as pointillism. And so he actually paints with these tiny dots of solid color, and they actually mix together to create different shades and tints and mixing to make different colors. And it's actually all optical. It's this optical color mixing theory that he creates called pointillism. And so sometimes it's really easy to remember Seurat, the dot, and so he invented pointillism, if that helps you a little bit. Cezanne was also interested in the formal structure and kind of developing that more from Impressionism. And so he wanted to study this relationship between adjoining brushstrokes of color and how he can use that to show form in space. And so Seurat kind of shrunk these brushstrokes down to actual dots, while Cezanne in this painting here kind of made these brushstrokes even looser and larger. And so here he's trying to reconstruct nature according to his own interpretation. And so he kind of flattens out the space, but does have a little bit of depth created by atmospheric perspective and the use of cool and warm colors. But he basically breaks up this landscape into geometric planes of the brush stroke. And so it's these very flat geometric shapes. Next we have Van Gogh's Starry Night. And he really moved forward with Impressionism because he wanted to start sharing his own personal feelings and insight. And so since Impressionism was pretty much just based on observation, he didn't feel like he could put a lot of his own emotion and thoughts into the work. And so that's what he wanted to change about Impressionism. And so he paints this very symbolic image to him. We have the hills echoing these kind of tremendous cosmic forces that are flowing through the sky. The town is in these kind of dark forms down below to symbolize this small scale of human life, and the church steeple reaches up past everything towards the heavens. And also in the very foreground of the painting we see a cypress tree, which was typically planted in graveyards in Europe during this time period as eternal life. And so he's kind of he's going through this time in his life when he realized how small he is based on, the entire universe and everything that's going on. And so that's what this painting is to depict. But it still has that very impressionistic brushstroke. Gauguin's The Vision After the Sermon. He is also trying to share his own personal insight with this painting. After he heard the sermon about the story of Jacob wrestling the angel, this is how he depicted it. And so he never saw this happen. It's not based on observation. It's completely from his imagination. And so that's very different than the Impressionist. And so it's kind of this symbolic symbol for unquestioning faith. And so this is kind of a step forward for personal expression for him. One thing that's very different about this painting is we've had all this development on creating space and this illusion of depth in two-dimensional pieces, but Gauguin considered this implied deep space a distraction. And so what he did, you can see here, he painted everything that would be the background a deep red. And so what that actually does is it makes it a little more confusing because red kind of comes forward towards you, and so it looks like everything's kind of stacked on top of each other, and Jacob and the angel are kind of floating in space. And so that's interesting to me, and that he was, even though space was figured out and he knew how to do it, he was still experimenting and trying to find something new and different to do. And so Gauguin, one of the things that's really influential about Gauguin's work is the color. And he influences color all the way through to today. And so these colors come from his memories from growing up in Peru. And there he saw a lot of ancient art and non-Western art. And he would see these rich colors in this art, and he believed it had a much more of a spiritual strength than our European art, and that our European art was kind of lacking this. And so he was trying to bring that back into the art. And so this piece here was painted in Tahiti at the age of 43. Gauguin actually left his family and ran away to Tahiti, and this is what his artwork started looking like then, and so the colors even become more intense and more tropical. Toulouse-Lautrec paints at the Moulin Rouge, and so we still see that impressionistic brushstroke. But he wants to depict the Paris nightclubs and brothels of this time period. And so instead of depicting exactly what he sees, he's depicting more of the mood. He uses these very unusual angles and cropped images and unnatural colors. And then the last post-impressionist piece we're going to look at is Munch's The Scream. And so Munch wanted to use this impressionistic style, but he wanted to use it to explore these extreme depths of emotions we have as human beings, such as grief, loneliness, fear, love, jealousy, death. And so he's trying to depict those in a painting. And so for Munch, the scream was based on the feeling of anxiety. And so he wants to kind of make us feel isolation, fear, and loneliness. He called this painting a soul cry.